Okay, cool. I think we are live and good. Hi, everyone. Matt Hodges here, who is going to share a little bit about pricing and packaging and just generally product marketing. Matt was early at Intercom. Prior to that was at Atlassian, and most recently was the VP of marketing at Loom. And so we're excited to spend some time on how you think about pricing, packaging, broader product marketing and positioning for early stage companies. I know that you've been super helpful with some seed and Series A companies recently, and so we're excited to learn from you.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Brian. Apologies if you can hear birds chirping in the background. It's 9 a.m. here in Sydney, and I'm in the backyard in a shed, and so there's a lot of birds outside.
That's great. I mean, the future of work is distributed, so thanks for joining from across the world. That's great. So I'd love to spend some time. Have quite a diverse experience coming from both Atlassian and Intercom, building out sort of the executive team and now advising early stage companies. I'd love to learn a little bit more about sort of definitionally, how do you think about product marketing versus pricing and packaging versus all of these things that come after that initial hire? We have a lot of startups on the call that have either made their first marketing hire or they're thinking about making their first head of operations hire. Like, how do you think about structurally what needs to come next as far as collaborating directly with founders as you think about strategy and more the business and go-to-market side of things?
Cool. It's a lot that unpack. I would say at the highest level, all of these things are connected, and your mileage may vary based on what I share, based on like what stage of company you're at, what your goals are as a business. But what I think I'll do is maybe speak to the experiences I had at a high level at the different companies that I've worked at over the past 13 years or so. And then what my immediate areas of focus were when I joined each of them, specifically Intercom and Loom most recently. So I started my career in tech at Atlassian, kind of unintentionally. I didn't necessarily go to uni thinking that I would ever end up in tech. I was always someone that was interested in technology and gadgets and products. And I just knew Mike and Scott, the co-founders, CEOs of Atlassian, through the course that I did at university. They were a few years ahead of me. And so when I joined Atlassian, I really had no idea what I was getting into. And look at their website when I joined to what it is today. The company has changed dramatically. So I joined them when they were about 100 employees, started in Sydney. I was in a pre-sales role. And by the time I left, six years later, I'd moved to San Francisco, where I spent 5.5 years working out of the SF office there. And there were about 1,000 employees when I left. And so my time at Atlassian varied from being an individual contributor on a set, like a pre-sales team, which is really what you now probably call a customer success role, to being head of marketing for their collaboration business. But I was never a member of the executive team or like a senior manager at Atlassian. And I share that because it's pretty relevant to how my experiences differed in my time at Atlassian to Intercom and Loom. And so when I joined Intercom, they were 50 employees. And the big difference between Intercom and Atlassian, I would say, is that this was my first time working for a VC-backed company. As you know, Atlassian did raise a round of equity from Excel partners. That was really the only money they ever raised. They'd always been a profitable business, growing like that, very fast and very predictably. And so Intercom was the first time I worked for a VC-backed company, which comes with a different set of challenges and goals. And joined them when there were 50 employees, spent 5.5 years there, and built out marketing from scratch, ran marketing for a few years in conjunction with Des Traynor, who's one of the co-founders and chief strategy officer there, still a great mate of mine. And a year and a half before I left, I moved into a role on the product team, which I could talk more directly about. And when I left Intercom, there were about 700 employees. And then lastly, and then I'll come back to my time at Intercom and actually answer your question, I was at Loom. I joined when there were 33 employees. And when I left end of last year, they had just tipped over 100. in a little over a year and 4 months. So at all three companies, I saw crazy, crazy growth, both in terms of employees and revenue, and a lot of the same types of challenges along the way at kind of different stages in my career. So my involvement in each of them was a little bit different. So coming back to your question, when I joined Intercom, they were $1 million in ARR. They had a product in market that had tractions. They had some early product market fit. And I was the first marketing hire. So this was the first investment in marketing. I joined a month after the first sales hire, and a month after the first hire on the in research on the product side of the business. And so my immediate focus when I joined Intercom was actually figuring out positioning and messaging, which is something that I guess is a common thread with all the companies that I've worked with since. That's kind of my first area of focus. And I was directly involved in pricing and packaging at Intercom, although that was owned by the growth team at the time. And ownership of pricing and packaging is probably another whole topic of conversation. Who does it make sense to own pricing and packaging?
Yeah.
But that was really what I focused on at Intercom. So positioning and messaging, we redid the website, and then just started to build out the early foundations of a marketing team, hiring in the different disciplines based on our beliefs of what were most important for Intercom, and kind of some things that I inherited. If you know Intercom well at all, they had a very strong and still do have a very strong content game. And that was really something that came from the top down, from Owen, Des, and Paul Adams. And that continued to be a pretty strong focus for Intercom in my time there. And then when I joined Loom, I joined even earlier stage. So I joined just as they'd raised, or before they'd raised a Series B. Smaller company, no product in market for teams or businesses to use. Loom at the time was a product for individuals, but they were in the middle of building out capabilities to make the transition from being just a tool for individuals to being a tool for teams and companies. And so I think one of my first two areas of focus there, in addition to figuring out how do we explain what Loom is and what position we want to hold in market, was actually designing pricing and packaging pretty much from scratch, because it was the first time that we were bringing to market a product that we wanted to sell to groups of people and not just individuals, in addition to a whole new set of capabilities to come alongside that. And so, yeah, tell me now, I'll pause there for a moment because I'm conscious of how much I've been talking. Did I answer the question? Did not I answer it?
No, that's that makes a ton of sense. One thing that I'd like to double click on is with Intercom in particular. The company has a very specific culture, and I feel like the job of achieving a few things. One is everyone on content. So anyone in any different job title has done an amazing job of creating content, which has been great. I also remember in the very early days of Intercom, there was a really unique focus around speaking directly to product managers and to, really articulate the jobs to be done framework. And the third thing is with Intercom in particular, it was awesome to see the evolution from a single products. And so I'd love to understand how you thought about that at the earliest stages, and to what extent is there repeatability for other startups that are thinking about at what milestones or inflection points does it make sense to start thinking about layering in more products over time?
Totally. So I'll start with the kind of focus around content and content as a strategy. So another hire that was made within a month of me joining Intercom I was director of product marketing at the time, was John Collins. So I know, I think you spoke with John recently. He recently finished up with Intercom after 7.5 amazing years, and has moved into, I think he's in the fintech startup space now,
yep.
Where he's looking to recreate his success there. And John is a journalist by background. So he joined Intercom directly from the Irish Times. And I share that because I think it speaks to how much Des and Owen believed in content as a strategy, but also knowing that it was a long-term game and that they weren't necessarily looking for immediate results. And they'd had a lot of success with content before hiring John, simply by writing about topics that they were interested and knowledgeable in. And to your point, a lot of those things were actually topics of interest to product people and or founders of early stage companies. So I think the first point I'd make is like, you either believe content is a long-term investment or you don't, and that will typically probably dictate your strategy with content. So Intercom always invested a lot. And as you'd said, it was something that everyone in the company was involved in. It was almost like a milestone when you were published on Inside Intercom, which is still the name of the publication today, although it's now much more than just a written publication. It's a podcast. There are books. There are events there used to be pre-COVID, in-person events, under the theme or umbrella of Inside Intercom. And so long-term investment, company-wide goals built around it. And you really did get a sense of pride and satisfaction when you were published, because the quality bar, and this was something that was, I guess, part of Intercom's culture and DNA, the quality bar for everything in Intercom was extremely high, which, comes with another set of challenges around the pressure that puts on you, but ultimately pushes you to be better. And so, yeah, that's my thinking around my response to the questions around content, and how it does need to be something that's invested in with a long-term view in mind. And, you need to spend money on it, knowing that it'll probably take a while to pay off. The last thing I'd probably say on that point is, I remember, this is more anecdotal, fun story for me to tell than anything else, but hopefully of value to the audience, is I remember when I was interviewing for the role at Intercom, my third interview was with Des, and it was more of a meet and greet. We went to a bar in downtown San Francisco and had a beer, or a couple of beers, or pints as Des would call them. And I remember talking to Des about his thoughts on content, and he was telling me about the ambition the company had to, publish books one day. And I kind of look back at that comment that he made then, and I look now and I'm like, wow, they really did achieve that. They have published 4 or 5 books, and have a very successful podcast as well. So I think, if you have something you believe deeply in and you have conviction behind it, you really can achieve those goals. Anything else on content? Did I touch on that one enough?
That answers it well. I mean, was that an expectation that was set up front, where every new hire that would join the team, there was an expectation that they would contribute on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, or what was happening behind the scenes as far as like optically you can see a lot of content, but I think executionally a lot of founders have questions around to what extent is that something you can encourage or incentivize engineers or every new hire to actively contribute?
Totally. Yeah, there was one point in time where it was a company goal that there was at least a contribution from every sub team. I think, cool. I forget what level we went down to, but it was never a standing, you must produce a post on Inside Intercom every quarter. But there was definitely moments in time where, maybe we had slowed down and we needed people to, submit ideas because we weren't publishing at the cadence, or we weren't getting what we called those heavy hitter posts that led to a lot of organic inbound growth that we had got in the past. So moments in time led for specific goals to be set around publishing of content. But I think my observation is that because it was just so common, especially for leadership, to publish on Inside Intercom, like if you look at the most published authors on Inside Intercom, it's probably still Des and Paul, and maybe a few of the other leaders on the product side of the business. And when you see leadership being able to make the time to publish on the blog, and it not just being an effort driven by marketing, which is typically the case, then I think it just inspires everyone and gives them a greater sense of, I'm welcome to share my experiences and my advice on particular topics, as long as there's synergy with our strategy. But also, if leadership can make the time to do it, surely I can make the time to do it as well. So it was never an inherent expectation, but I think the culture kind of just set itself up well for people to feel like they should contribute and are welcome to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and it was interesting to see the evolution of Intercom's journey, because I feel like the definition of the problem and the audience, like to make such a strong statement and say we are speaking to product managers or we are speaking to these particular personas inside of a tech company, was really very impressive to see. What sort of conversations were you having internally, or how did you think about some of the personas in the earliest days of Intercom?
There was definitely less of a focus on personas. And so I think most people on this call would be probably aware that Intercom are big believers in the jobs to be done methodology, not just as it relates to building product, but also how they approach go-to-market. That became less and less true on the go-to-market side as the company grew and scaled and got more sophisticated and needed to get more sophisticated. And the typical persona-based approach and development of buyer personas was actually something we focused on and I focused on before I wrapped up. But we took more of a jobs to be done approach, which meant that we didn't specifically say early on, at least, we're going to write for heads of demand gen at B2B companies of 100 to 500 employees. Like, that level of sophistication came way, way later. And it was more a case of, all right, with this as a topic of interest to us, we're a B2B SaaS company. We've learned something from it. Let's share what we've learned and our thoughts on the topic and start a conversation around that, because we're pretty confident other companies like us or companies that aspire to be like us will be interested in it too. So I think that was at its kind of most basic level. What do we believe is interesting and topical, where we could shed some insight based on things we've done well or not so well, or lessons we've learned. We even had a whole world tour called Lessons Learned at one point in time. And so I think it was much more about that, just like writing based on intuition of what we felt would be interesting. And then later came, okay, to give a specific example, Drift are clearly eating our lunch in a particular part and segment of the market. Do we want to compete? If so, well, they're doing a great job of winning the minds and hearts of the sales and go-to-market audience. How do we combat that? Like, what approach do we take? And that was I don't want to use the word difficult. It was less natural for Intercom to do that than the approach they'd been taken in the past, because sales was something that was built out later in the company's life, as was marketing. And so there was less, I guess, tribal knowledge or learnings or a willingness to write about things that sales and marketing teams would care about on inside Intercom than they were product design engineering teams. And so that was something that felt maybe a little bit more forced, but was still done well, but came less naturally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Internally, were you measuring, were you tracking Drift like head to head, or how did you think about competitive pressure, and did that influence how you thought about the pricing and packaging of Intercom moving forward?
Yeah, 100% we were tracking them head to head. Like, there's different schools of thought when it comes to competition, schools of thought when it comes to competition. And I was actually just referencing a tweet earlier today that a company had made, basically saying, don't worry about your competitors, just worry about your customers. I really disagree with that. I think you should always keep a pulse on the competitive landscape, know who your competitors are or who they may be in the future, not to directly inform what you do. And you certainly don't want to be reactive, although sometimes you may need to be reactive. But just listening to your customers, I think you're missing half the story. So we definitely followed Drift very closely. I remember being at executive offsite in Sonoma, I think it was, when they first launched, like their 1.0 launch. And it looked very, very similar to Intercom at that point in time. And then I think they figured out like a niche in market and how they could create their own identity, and did an excellent job on the go-to-market front, positioning themselves against Intercom and how they were different and better. And so we definitely took notice of that. And determined, well, what do we need to do to close some key gaps if this is a market that we want to compete in as well, based on a longer term strategy in mind. So yeah, we definitely followed Drift. And then as it relates to pricing and packaging, I think regardless of your stage or what type of pricing and packaging project you're running, for me at Intercom, I ran the last redesign of pricing and packaging. Sorry if there's anyone on the call that hates me for that. There probably are some, because Intercom's pricing can be confusing and a bit challenging at times. But one of the key inputs into that project in the design of how we packaged and then how we layered in pricing methods was looking at the competitive landscape, knowing that we would be directly evaluated against X set of tools. Our price points would be compared directly. And one of the principles I've always had with pricing is you want to be comprehensible. You want your pricing to be comprehensible, so people should be able to understand it. How much is it going to cost you today? How much is it going to cost you over time? And there is an element of wanting it to be easy to compare. So to give an example, support is one of the customer service is one of the primary markets that Intercom competes in, and Zendesk is probably arguably the incumbent in that space. And when you start to think about, well, what price point should we set if we're going to do seat-based pricing? I think your first point of call is to look at the competitive landscape and determine, well, what's the most expensive competitor and what's the least expensive? And what is it to start initially and what will it cost over time with growth? Where do we want to fit in on that spectrum? Do we want to be more expensive, less expensive, in the middle, more expensive to start, less expensive to start? So I think looking at your competitors and how they price is super important as an input to how you think about pricing and packaging, because people have expectations, and they have expectations, and then they have, what's the right word here? It's still early-ish in the morning for me. My brain's not 100% yet. They have expectations around how they should pay and what they should pay based on what they are currently using.
Yeah.
Whether that's a direct alternative to your product or even a complementary product. And I could speak more about that from a Loom perspective if that would be helpful, but definitely you should absolutely be aware of competition and use it as an input when devising go-to-market strategy and pricing and packaging.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I was working on pricing and packaging on the Zendesk side of things, the catalyzing force behind Zendesk for Startups was the fact that we had Front and a number of new competitors that were getting started, where at the surface they look quite different. Maybe their features are slightly different. However, whoever ends up locking in those customers, and you have, especially with SaaS companies, you see really strong, and so whoever ends up closing the startups sooner rather than later are the ones that benefit from having the medium to long-term retention. And so that's something that we thought about, as far as, sure, they may not be a direct competitor, but if we don't heavily discount or build out the right features to also capture some of these newer competitors and really play friendly with startups, that's going to be harder for us long term, where Zendesk may be more of the incumbent on the mid-market or on the enterprise, because large customer support teams know how to use the product. For founders or head of operations or the first support hire, they may be less, there's less of a inclination to automatically go with something like Zendesk, because they're looking for whatever's easy and cheap and something that you can get started with pretty quickly.
It's funny you bring that up. I remember distinctly, within the first 6 months of joining Intercom, we worked with the Rewired group based out of, where were they at the time? Detroit. And we did an extensive study with them to understand what jobs people were hiring Intercom for. This is back in 2014. And one of them was support. And the job we identified was help me fix support.
Yeah.
And it was typically had these relatively early stage companies who would, ship a massive bug, or they'd have this moment in time where they had this massive influx of support requests. And their current process broke, and they immediately would look to Zendesk, which was just, it's got so much brand awareness and recognition, and is a fantastic product. But we'd get a lot of people that would look and evaluate Zendesk and think it was too much and too complex for them, and they wanted something simpler, but maybe they would graduate to Zendesk in the future. And so I think that's a great example, and Intercom had the same set of challenges where it's the classic dilemma of how do you protect the bottom of the market as you inevitably need to move up market in order to continue to grow at the rates you need to grow at to justify your valuation, or as a public company, continue to grow your public valuation.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Let's switch gears a little bit, because I know you're spending a lot of time with early stage companies, and a lot of the startups that are on the call, they're in more of a closed beta or waitlist phase of their company life cycle. And so I'd love to understand a little bit more about what are the strategies or questions that you can ask early customers when you're in more of this closed beta or waitlist experience to help you build a strong foundation for the future of pricing and packaging.
Totally. I've made some notes here. So if I'm looking at my screen, I'm trying to think through, okay, what are some of the questions that are most relevant here? The first thing I would say, just as a disclaimer, is I've never worked at a company like as a full-time employee or owned pricing and packaging where the product wasn't already in market. I think the closest example of my direct experience there would have been when I joined Loom. And as I'd mentioned, they had a product in market for individuals, and we were about to release a bunch of team-based capabilities, which led to a complete redesign of pricing and packaging. But just a disclaimer there. So your mileage may vary with my advice here. But I think number one would be aligning on internally, what are your goals with your release? And specifically as it relates to pricing, what's your strategy? Tungus from Redpoint has some a lot of great articles on pricing. When I was tasked with writing Intercom's pricing and packaging strategy, when we redid pricing and packaging, his posts were an excellent resource in helping me think about how should I even structure a strategy document. But in its simplest terms, are you looking for market penetration and are optimizing for growth and adoption, or is your go-to-market motion different, and instead you're maybe selling more up market and you're trying to optimize for revenue, and you're less concerned about customer growth? So I think having some clear internal alignment around what you're trying to achieve and maybe some hypotheses before you go into market is really important. Specifically, what should you ask your customers? I think, this is based on a lot of my time at Intercom and jobs to be done thinking and starting from first principles. I think you want to understand what problem they're trying to solve with your product. So asking them that directly, and you probably want to do this over in-person interviews and maybe rely less on sending out a survey, but talk to your customers and understand from their perspective, if they had access to your product based on how you've been positioning it in market that compelled them to sign up, what problem do they expect to be able to solve with it? So that would be number one. And based on that, what are they currently using today that they're either going to be replacing or moving away from? Maybe they're implementing a solution for the very first time, but what's their current situation today that they're moving away from when they do get access to your product? And that will probably give you some further things to then go and explore yourself. So if you hear a common theme around a specific tool or a set of tools that they're going to replace, I would then go and have a look at how those products are priced and packaged, because ultimately that'll be again, to use the language I used earlier, an expectation that you'll probably need to meet with your own pricing. And so if people are used to paying X dollars a month for, alternative A, then that's a pretty good guide for you as you come to market for the first time to help you understand how you should price your product. So what are they using today, if anything? And then kind of just moving down my list of questions here, I think getting some more business context from them. You've probably already captured. If you haven't, you should always capture company size so that you can always cut and slice your data based on the size of customer. Historically, in my experience, has shown me that the larger the customer, the higher the willingness to pay for software, which makes sense. If you're a larger business, you're probably more mature as a business and you have more budget to spend on software. But that's number one, like understand some bit more context about the business, maybe some more context around the person who has signed up. What is their role in the purchase process? Are they the decision maker? Are they the buyer? Are they the user? So what is the process for them? Should they decide to go ahead and purchase your product when it's available and they can pay for it? But I think most important thing, as I mentioned at the top, is what problem are they trying to solve? And then if you want to get a little bit more features oriented, which will help you inform how you might think about packaging your product, which is how do you allocate different features across plans? Are there specific features or capabilities that they're particularly drawn to, or they believe they'll derive a lot more value from? So that'll give you a sense of what are our must-haves versus nice-to-haves versus our table stakes. And that should probably be a good way to help inform, in addition to how competitors are packaging their product, how you should think about packaging a product as well. Because my philosophy is you don't want to deviate too much from what the expectations are based on what is already in market, especially at an early stage. That can come later once you've got product market fit.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it raises such an interesting point because I talk to a lot of startups that are afraid or unsure at what point it makes sense to introduce the name of a possible competitor. But I also think in having some of these direct and honest conversations, you get to map out who are your direct competitors and then maybe who are your indirect competitors, and ones where, especially at the earliest stages, you may have startups or smaller teams that are stitching together tools in different ways. And so even some of the ones that may not be currently positioned as direct competition or ones that have mind share, or they have a lot of influence in the ecosystem. And so I think it's a really good question to ask to figure out exactly like what tools are you using, how much are you paying for them, just to map out like their broader.
Yeah, I think maybe two things I'd add there to the degree that they're helpful. And this is something I'm doing with each company that I'm currently working with. So I'm currently working with Val. Whenever I say that, people ask me to repeat it because of my accent. VOWEL, as in AEIOU, Val, val.com. I've been working with them, and I'm also working with Command E, which I know is part of the work-life portfolio. And one of the first exercises I do after I've worked with the founding team on articulating vision, mission, and strategy is mapping out the positioning canvas. I use a template from April Dunford. You can Google April Dunford positioning canvas. You'll find the template that I use. I don't try and reinvent the wheel. And the way in which I look at the landscape is I categorize competitors as either direct, indirect, as you mentioned, and then there's also a category of replacement competitors. So direct competitors are those where you're directly competing, very similar product, if not the same product offering, and you're competing for the same time and budget of the customer. Then there are indirect competitors, which are similar product but have different business goals themselves. So a tangible example here, if I use Loom, a direct competitor to Loom would be Cloud App. Cloud App is a video and screen shot sharing tool. It's been on the market for a long time. Direct competitor to Loom. Then there is it's always hard to say that one, but Phil from Evernote, his new company. And I actually classify them as an indirect competitor to Loom because they're not trying to be, at least today, a solution for video messaging and quick back and forth communication using asynchronous video. They are trying to create a tool that allows people to create much higher production value videos. And so I actually view them as an indirect competitor to Loom. But then there are the whole category of replacement competitors. What is competing for the same time and budget, but isn't the same product offering that you have? So, and again, using Loom as an example, a replacement competitor for Loom is email. It is Slack, where often Loom is used in complement to, but over time, if Loom does its job well as a product, then you could see Loom completely replacing someone's reliance on email or Slack or meetings. And so that's how I like to look at the competitive landscape: direct, indirect, and replacement. And then from there, I do a basic strength and weakness analysis with a focus on direct competitors. And pricing and packaging, I really just look at direct competitors. So I'm going to mention anything else there? No, I think that's it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And then from there, once you map out the canvas, do you start to look at what are the analytics and workflows and things that you need to have in place to begin effectively measuring? Or how do you think about like what comes after some of this market mapping and competitive analysis?
Yeah, so I think some of those things are separate. So the positioning canvas work that I've done is more so to inform messaging guide. And, how do we describe ourselves in market? What do we believe our key value props are based on our product today and where the product is headed? What are our unique differentiators? Why should customers believe in us? Whereas some of the other things you mentioned to me in the work that I've done more fit into pricing strategy. So I have a separate template that I use to write out what the strategy is around pricing and packaging, and it spans from what are we trying to achieve to, depending on the stage of the company, what problems are we trying to solve, which was particularly relevant for the work that I did at Intercom because there were many problems with pricing and packaging that we were trying to solve at the time, to a data dictionary, which is basically just a glossary of some of the key terms that we have that we want to kind of standardize across the company so that when we look at a chart or we're looking at a piece of data, we're all speaking the same language and we're not making assumptions on something that we're looking at because we're not clear on how this word is being used here versus how that same concept is being used over here, but it's labeled differently. So I have this pricing and packaging strategy template, and a part of that is, let me just turn off my notifications. That's my father-in-law messaging me. Nothing bad. Okay, that was distracting. One moment, let me go back to my train of thought. Another section in that document is measures of success. So I think I mentioned earlier that it's important to align on, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? Which should inform your pricing strategy for, I won't say which companies, but, earlier stage companies, you're probably better off if you have a self-service go-to-market motion, taking a strategy around penetration and optimizing for customer growth and adoption of revenue maximization. And that will then inform what some of your key measures of success will be. But if I ignore actual, benchmarks that you're trying to hit, I think the most important analytics, quote unquote analytics, to be looking at are, average revenue per customer. What do you think? What are some of your hypotheses based on that? Net revenue retention, which is obviously a factor of a number of different inputs. But to cut a long story short, I think at least in my time at Intercom and then the companies that I have been working at, I always think that net revenue retention is a really good North Star metric to look at because it does take into consideration initial ARPA, it does take into consideration contraction and churn and expansion. And so that's one that I often encourage companies to have an eye towards, knowing that it takes a long time to actually see what your net revenue retention will be once pricing and packaging is in market.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I also think your background is really compelling from the perspective that you started essentially in more of a customer success role. So you understand exactly why net revenue retention and some of these like post-sales and customer programs are really important. Do you think that factors into your strategy around pricing and packaging? Like, do you have that more customer retention lens, or how does it vary from company to company?
Good question. I think the penny dropped for me when I was at Intercom, and I say that because, a little bit more context on my time at Atlassian. This maybe shows my age a little bit, but when I started at Atlassian, cloud wasn't a thing. There was no such thing as SaaS. I think SaaS maybe came onto the scene as a concept maybe a year and a half after I joined, when Salesforce came onto the scene. And I was a user of Salesforce back then, and that really taught me that I never want to use Salesforce ever again. But that's a different story. When I joined Atlassian, there was no concept of cloud. We sold on-prem. So you would download Confluence. You'd have to figure out how to install it by running lines of code in your command line. And that's often what I help people do, is help them with installation. And then you get a license key that you put in, and that gave you a free 30-day trial. And that was kind of a revelation at the time. Like, you couldn't use an alternative to Atlassian's products without engaging with the sales team. And so it really started this kind of new approach to selling software, which was this, self-service approach. And Atlassian really pioneered that, I think. But because of the role I had at Atlassian, I was not a quota-carrying salesperson. My job was really to help people. And so I was never targeted based on the number of trials that were started. I was really targeted based on my response time to customers and their satisfaction. So I think maybe that's kind of in the DNA in terms of how I think about customers and how I approach things. I've always got a customer-first approach. And when I joined Intercom, Intercom was a SaaS business. They built a software as a service product. That was, who they were as a business. And I learned a lot about software as a service and go to market from Intercom. But towards the end of my time there, we'd gone from 1 to 5 million in ARR to where did we go? 1 to 5, 5 to 20, 20 to 50, 50 to 80, 80 to 120 over 5 years. And then we started to slow down, which I think is pretty natural after seeing that crazy growth. And one of the projects I was a part of, which led to this bigger project around pricing and packaging, was understanding why net revenue retention had dropped so much for specific segments of customers. And I won't go into details because I can't. But we'd identified this problem in the business, and we sought out to figure out what were the causes of this drop in net revenue retention. And if you know anything about Intercom's history, Intercom started as a single product, became multiple product SKUs, still thought of as a product, but there were multiple product offerings you could buy. At one point in time, we called those packages, and another point in time, we called them solutions. Then we started calling them products. Then we bundled them again. Like, we could spend an hour talking about that. But that led to this crazy growth, which was reflected in revenue and also in customer base, because we were able to position ourselves more distinctly for different markets and segments. But it also led to a lot of problems later down the track when Intercom got wildly too expensive for certain segments of customers, and we were over monetizing some and under monetizing others. But it all came down to that North Star metric that was net revenue retention. And there are a number of problems that we sought out to solve with pricing and packaging, but a lot of them related to how we'd actually packaged and bundled the product, specific metrics that we were using to price each of those products, overlap between different offerings because of the way that we package them. And in that period of time, the market had also changed pretty dramatically. Like, Zendesk had started to expand out of the customer service space. Yeah. Drift had come onto the scene. 10, 20 other competitors had come into the scene in the marketing automation space. So a lot had changed in the market that kind of forced our hand as well to rethink how we were doing things at Intercom. But for us, when we undertook that project, ultimately the needle we were trying to move was net revenue retention for specific segments of customers, which is why the project took an incredibly long time, because you had to understand the problems, design solutions to those problems, test them, build them, and then the results of those tests took up to 6 months.
Yeah, so, that makes a ton of sense. I'm going to invite a couple of early stage companies just to ask you some questions, just because I find today the go-to-market has changed really quickly. I think in the world when we were growing up or just getting started in our career, like, SaaS was very new. Now we're actually seeing this shift away from maybe building an MVP, shipping on broadly, to now going maybe more smaller batch design partners, closed beta. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how you think about, choosing design partners, and how do you think about monetization with some of your early design partners, just because it does feel like there's a lot happening, and how you design your go-to-market experience as opposed to just building and shipping something broadly. I think companies are getting pretty strategic and getting more creative with how they think about it.
Sure. Do we have questions were there specific questions that were coming up?
I've invited a few people up to speak. I'll keep speaking, and then if someone wants to jump in, feel free to jump in as well. But One of the interesting things is like, specifically with developer tools or ones that are a bit more technical in nature, we are seeing that companies are choosing to partner with just maybe a handful of paid beta customers. I'd love to understand how you think about and, you know, to what extent, like what are the milestones or inflection points that you would encourage a company to look for before they open up to a broader pilot or even to just public availability?
Right. So it's something I've seen, well, maybe a macro point I'd make is, to the degree you're comfortable and that you can, and this is really, you know, much easier if you have a dedicated salesperson or team to run this for you. You should always, you know, test, I use the word test lightly here, pricing and packaging and market by running it by customers and speaking to them. And so beta customers are a great pool of people that you can do that with. And so specifically at Loom, when we had just started to build out sales at Loom, it was at the time that we had promoted that. We had new team and enterprise plans that were in private beta. And Pete, who was running sales at Loom at the time, had experience running, you know, paid pilots and seen a lot of success with those based on his time at Intercom. And that was a similar approach that we took at Loom, where we worked with a small set of customers where we, you know, encourage them to, you know, have some skin in the game themselves by having them commit to paying X amount for their first 3 months of usage, which was typically at a, you know, heavy discount to what they would end up having to pay if the tool was of value and it ended up being adopted and it was sticky. But I do think there's a lot to be said for, you know, actually asking select groups of beta customers to pay. Make sure that they're incentivized through the form of discounts and some benefit to them in the future, and they'll be rewarded for, you know, ultimately helping you learn. The other approach you can take is not charge beta customers at all, but whatever path you take, I do think it's important to set very clear expectations from the get-go that this will be a paid product or a paid feature. If you already have a product to market and you're releasing a significant chunk of new functionality, just set that expectation ahead of time so that there are no surprises. And when you do, you know, go to GA or you roll out the feature more widely or the product more widely, and you do have pricing in market, I've always been someone that's been a bit more, as I'd mentioned earlier, maybe more customer centric. Do whatever you can to be generous with your grandfathering of existing customers or what you do for your beta customers. So with Val as an example, we just introduced pricing for the first time. And for all beta customers, we'd had a private beta running for months. We've given them their first 12 months free. And then I forget the exact number, but the next X months after that at a heavy discount, just as a, you know, token of our generosity for their belief in Val and also their willingness to give us feedback, which is so crucial at an early stage. Looks like we've got some people with questions, maybe.
I can go. Does my mic work? Awesome. So Matt, it's funny you bring up Val. Val is an awesome product. And while you were talking, I just pinged Andy. I said, "Oh, look, we're on this webinar and Matt's here." And he says great things. That was awesome. People should check it out. I really like using it. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, really awesome points. So for us, we are in private beta, and a little bit of how we charge is kind of just throwing numbers out there where we're saying the first couple customers say, "Hey, we're going to charge you this amount, but we'll give you a heavy discount." You're like, "Okay." And then some customers, we say, "Okay, we're going to charge you." And then they ask, "Oh, how much?" And we say, "Oh, we're going to charge this amount." They say, "Oh, that's too little." But we still give them the small amount. And then the next customer, we charge them a little more. And we're like, we're charging all these people different amounts. And then we're also internally thinking, okay, maybe we should charge them for this part of the feature, right? Like usage-based, because doing a seat-based right now, but we're thinking maybe there's some things that we can charge in terms of usage. But how would you start introducing those things? Where do you do them to your old customers or new customers, where you say, "Hey, here's the base fee, but we're going to charge this much amount"? And then do you only do that for new users, or do you kind of run it by your current users and see how they like that or how they react to that. And then based on how they react, you kind of charge your future customers. How would you go about that? How would you evolve your pricing strategy, experimenting on people, etc.?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for using Val. That's awesome. I'm glad you're getting value from the product. It's early days, but if you aren't familiar with Val, do check it out. Look, what I'd say is the fun thing about pricing and packaging is there's no right answer to anything. And anything I say right now is not an answer, it's advice based on my direct experience. So it may or may not work for you. But I think it's always worthwhile getting feedback from existing customers and getting their thoughts on things, but have your own clear hypotheses in mind or opinions and seek to validate or invalidate, knowing that every customer you talk to is likely going to have a slightly different opinion based on their situation. And so some customers might be comfortable with usage-based pricing, others might not. Some customers might hate seat-based pricing, some customers may love it. So I think you need to talk to a lot of people in order to get enough of a sample size to see very clear patterns, which is why I would often just give the advice that whatever you hear from your customers, make sure you use it as an input to guiding your own opinions. And you'll find things that will maybe are very clear that simply aren't going to work, but there's always going to be, I think, a bit of a gray area just because everyone has a different opinion. So I typically tend to not deviate too much from the norm. And I'll give an example with usage-based pricing here. So historically, Intercom had always been priced based on this nebulous metric that was it actually was called different things over time, called active people. And it was the number of people that you were tracking in Intercom or had in your Intercom database that you may or may not engage with in terms of sending the messages or them sending you messages. And that was a metric that served Intercom very well. It was a value-based metric. We believed that there was value in you having access to message these customers at any point in time, see their activity over time. And funnily enough, it was a way that a lot of other alternatives also priced at the time. And then as the product evolved, that metric became less, it made less sense for specific uses of Intercom, support being an example. If you were using Intercom for outbound messaging, it was also less relevant for that particular use case. And then I mentioned before that the market evolved at the same time. And long story short, the changes that we made to pricing were largely informed by what our customers' expectations were when they were buying Intercom for a given job to be done, which to them was informed by what they were already using or what they were replacing and using alongside of Intercom. And so we ended up adopting for our support product a seat-based approach to pricing, because if you were coming to Intercom, you were probably coming from a Zendesk or, I forget Salesforce's name for their service product offering. It was Desk.com and then it was rebranded. I forget what they call that now, Service Cloud maybe. If you were buying HubSpot, they have their support offering, all have seat-based pricing. Pretty clear that people like to pay based on seats. And the nice thing about seat-based pricing is it's very predictable. People understand it. It's predictable, it's within their control. And customers love those three things. Whole separate conversation around price point per seat, whether you have an included number with a plan, which is effectively having a floor on your pricing and ceilings to drive upgrades. That's a whole other set of strategies. But with the metric itself, I think usage metrics can work if they are predictable and comprehensible. And so that active people metric that I mentioned, not comprehensible, required a lot of explanation and nuance to how it actually worked. Worked well for B2B companies, didn't work well for B2C companies who had large amounts of active users, a lot of them who weren't paying them any money, and impossible to predict. And so you just had no idea how much Intercom was going to cost you in the future. And so I think that's the challenge with usage-based metrics. On paper, they sound great. You can charge based on usage, only pay for what you use, but it needs to be something you understand how it works, and it needs to be something that you can predict, because I think, more savvy buyers will make sure that a product that they're adopting today, that they don't want to be switching off in 3 months or 6 months or 12 months from now, is a bit more future-proof. So they need to have a sense for what is it going to cost them over time. And if they can't predict that, they may go with the competitor where they can predict what it's actually going to cost them. And then, so another way to think about usage-based metrics is maybe they're not the primary metric by which you charge, but they are a limit that you enforce on plans to drive paid upgrades commensurate with value that's realized. And so an example of that would be the usage limit that we put on Loom's free plan, which was the 5-minute recording limit, which there was, a bit of an uproar from existing customers when we introduced that limit. But in terms of the actual, I use these words loosely, blast radius, it was a pretty small percentage of customers that had an issue with that limit. We obviously grandfathered people, but it was a very effective means of driving paid upgrades to the paid pro plan. And it was a one-time kind of thing. You hit that limit, then you end up paying a new set price, but it didn't impact how much you paid over time. And we obviously did our homework, made sure that the limit we put in place was really generous when compared to the competitive landscape. I think the average limit across competitors was 90 seconds, and we were giving 5 minutes. And we also looked at, okay, based on our existing customers today, what percentage of those users would hit this limit in a given month? And are we comfortable with that percentage of users hitting the limit? One, are we comfortable with it? Two, is it going to be effective at driving upgrades? Because if only 5% of people are hitting it, then why have the limit in the first place? But if 90% of people are hitting it every month, your limit's probably a little bit too restrictive. And so those are a couple of different ways that I would look at that. Is that helpful? Did I answer the question or not? Probably a little bit.
Helpful. Yeah, you actually answered questions that I needed to know. I didn't know how to ask. So thank you so much.
Of course.
One question on that, Matt. How do you think about integrations and maybe some customizations that need to happen over time? Because I feel like many companies that are on the call, maybe they have a handful of integrations, but they're also exploring to what extent they need to build out more of an apps marketplace. And how do you think about pricing and packaging when there's some sort of workflow component or some sort of cross-company dependency?
All right. So I made some notes on this one. I'd say and there's a few different ways to think about this. There's the packaging question, which I'll get to at the end. Then there's kind of internal team structures and just general strategy around how you build out integrations and invest in integrations. So I'll start there, because my experience at Atlassian, Intercom, and Loom was different at every company, which I think speaks to every company is probably going to employ a different strategy based on what they're trying to achieve. So at Atlassian had always had a philosophy where they wanted to open up their product and allow people to build whatever they wanted to on top of it. So even in the days before Atlassian's cloud offerings, there was the plugin framework for Jira and Confluence and their developer tools. And there was a set of APIs that you can build and install your own plugins on. And that led to so many people building crazy things on top of their products, which made the products incredibly sticky, but also led to a lot of other issues because there wasn't a lot of quality control and frameworks around how to build integrations at the time, which led to people not being able to upgrade to future versions of Confluence and Jira. And you had customers who were stuck on a version of Jira that was 6 years old because they couldn't upgrade because they'd have to upgrade all their plugins. Anyway, that's another fun story. But when cloud became a big focus for Atlassian and the move towards what was internally branded at the time on demand, they invested heavily in the Atlassian marketplace, which is a huge part of their business today. Maybe 4 years ago, it was over 100 million in revenue. And so they built out a dedicated business unit within Atlassian that was made up of a lot of different cross-functional teams. You essentially had like a GM for the marketplace, and then you had product engineering, marketing leadership that formed that group. And so they, from the very beginning, always were very intentional about having an open platform that people could build on top of. And their strategy was, we'll focus on a very core set of use cases, and then solve for the 80%, and then we'll let the community solve for the remaining 20%. When I joined Intercom, the strategy was a little bit different. Intercom was always in the early days pretty closed. There weren't a lot of APIs that you can build on top of, but maybe 2.5 years into my time there, we did have a whole set of initiatives around opening up the platform, starting with the messenger. And the way in which the team was set up is we had a developer platform team based out of Dublin with a PM, engineer, researcher, dedicated product marketer. And their role was to build the framework and the set of APIs for not only internal teams to build on top of, but also for existing customers who were building private apps, but also businesses who wanted to build public apps on top of the messenger. So the developer platform team built that framework, designed it, and then internal teams, so the inbox team or the messages team, would then build on top of those. And then we did the same for the inbox when we opened up the inbox, and you can now build inbox apps on top of Intercom, taking a page out of Zendesk book. And then at Intercom, the strategy around integrations was dependent on what our strategy for any given integration was. So to give two different examples, we decided at a point in time we needed to build a Slack integration. And the Slack integration was to enable people to respond to conversations that were coming in through the messenger from leads, and allow salespeople, typically BDRs, ADRs, maybe customer success reps, to respond in Slack without having to go to Intercom. The reason we built that integration was because it was a gap in our offering when compared to alternatives in the market. And we were never trying to generate revenue from it. It was really to close a gap, allow us to tell a more compelling story from a go-to-market point of view, and reduce what was inevitably a hurdle to people adopting Intercom in the first place. Very different to deciding to build a Salesforce integration, which one is a much bigger lift. It's typically takes more time and effort to build a well-done integration with Salesforce. But we built that integration for a whole different set of reasons. It was built to unblock bigger deals. Not having a Salesforce integration was preventing us from even selling into larger companies. And it also represented a revenue generation opportunity, and allowed us to create a dedicated premium package based on how pricing was done at the time, because there was a willingness to pay for that integration. So very different to the Slack integration, where there wasn't a willingness to pay, but we still went ahead and built it. Whereas with Salesforce, there was, and it represented a revenue opportunity. But in both of those cases, we had a integrations team that built the integrations, or at least the first versions of them. And then they were given to respective product pillar teams based on who the target customer was. And then they would maintain and improve them over time. So that was kind of my experience at Intercom. And then when I joined Loom, it was super early days, but the approach Loom was taking at the time, and I couldn't speak today because I haven't caught up with the team for a few months recently, but there was a team, product teams were based on pillars of the product that we'd identified. There was the create team, which is all about the experience of recording and sharing videos. There was the collaborate and manage team, which was all about, once you'd recorded a video, how do you share that with your team, administration controls that come on top of Loom. And then there was the integrate team, which was focused on building SDKs for Loom. So there's a record SDK that's now in private beta, so you can integrate Loom directly in your app. But that team was also responsible for building integrations like their integration with Salesforce. So I think maybe the lesson from those two companies was have a team that's dedicated to either owning integrations or building out APIs so that internal teams can build their own integrations on top of that based on what are the most pressing needs for their target customers. Or you could take an approach similar to Tom and the team over at Command D, and hopefully I get this right. Tom might correct me if I get it wrong, but I know it maybe a year ago when I first met Tom, their strategy was outsourcing the development of integrations so that they could get a pretty big surface area in terms of the number of tools that their product integrates with. And they would maybe, get a third party to build 80% of that integration, and then they would finish off the remaining 20% that was maybe a little bit more nuanced work that required more intimate knowledge of how Command E worked as a product. And so that's a whole other approach where you can outsource the development of integrations as well. So that's team structure. If I just quickly touch on packaging, I think there's no single answer here. I think how you should think about packaging integrations and or pricing them if you decide to charge separately for them is dependent on your product and what problems your product solves. So to use Command E as one example, Command E's biggest value prop is that it connects to all of your tools, right? So it connects to all the tools that you use in the cloud so that you have one simple shortcut to access everything you need to get work done. So you can search Slack, you can search Notion, you can search Coda, you can search Airtable, you can search Google Docs, all through Command E. So it's in their benefit to make their integrations as accessible to as many people as possible, because that's what makes their product valuable and sticky. Now, perhaps there's a strategy, and we haven't got into pricing and packaging strategy yet, but perhaps you want to allow for X number of integrations on your free plan. And if you want more than X number of integrations, then you need to start paying. But that probably requires some investigation into what's the average number of integrations that your customers install today, and what's that tipping point that people will have seen enough value to justify paying to get access to more integrations, which I think is very different to Loom, which doesn't yet have a lot of integrations and are really just building integrations based on customer need. And it's more of an ad hoc decision when we decided to put something on the roadmap and then go and build it as to whether we were going to charge for it or not. Salesforce was an easy one. There's usually more willingness to pay for Salesforce integration. It's not needed by the majority of customers. Therefore, it usually slots naturally into one of your highest tiers. Whereas something that's more focused on generating more awareness and is not something that is going to be a key determinant in someone using your product, that's something that you typically put on your free plan. So again, like no single answer. It depends on your actual product and what your strategy is and the needs of your customers and their willingness to pay for those things.
Hello, I have a question. Not sure if we're still taking questions. Okay,
Go ahead,
cool.
for sure.
So I have a question about positioning. And I think, so first of all, we are open phone. We're a pretty horizontal product. We're a modern business phone for startups, small businesses, individuals. I think go-to-market wise, there is a very similar sort of motion compared to Loom. And the question I have is kind of very, very tactical. So it's something that's on our mind all the time. Our product is both for individuals and for teams. When we go on our website, since the very beginning, we've been serving individuals. So our messaging, our positioning has been so much about the value for you as an individual. And since we've launched the team offering, we have like a section on the homepage about teams, and we're like building additional pages. But there's always this question about if our main moneymaker is teams. So individuals bring us into teams, and that's why they're so wonderful. That's where we grow. But then teams is where we make the money. So when I look at Loom, very similar. It's all about individual on the homepage, and then there's the enterprise page. Is that working? Is that the gold standard? How do you advise companies with this type of horizontal product, bunch of use cases, both individual, both teams? How do you advise them to think about positioning? And I guess because the positioning comes first and then it's copy on the website.
Totally. Okay, how do I answer that one? So maybe I'll speak directly to what we actually did do at Loom, because I actually held a different opinion to what we ended up shipping. So maybe I'm just trying to figure out where to start to build enough context to let you know where we landed. So when I started with Loom, it was September 2019. You would go to the pricing page, or you'd go to the homepage, and the product was positioned as screen recording simplified, which was, vastly under positioning what Loom actually was at the time. And it took us a while to figure out exactly how to describe it. We ended up landing, we're a video messaging tool. And you could speak in more detail about how we ended up landing there. But we'd also, if you went to the pricing page, there was a free plan, a pro plan, and then a team plan and a business and enterprise. I forget what labels they had on them at the time. But there was a very clear distinction between individuals and teams. The homepage spoke directly to the end user, still does today, to your point, speaks to the person who's actually going to hit record and send a video message and the benefits they get from that. And then you can go down the particular path of learning about how to apply that in the context of sales, product, leadership, depending on what persona you are. But the pricing page today, there's no mention of individuals. It's all about teams. And so this was a debate that we had actually in one of our board meetings towards the end of last year as we were getting close to launching pricing and packaging. And the plan had always been to have a set of plans for individuals, which I think if you even go to Miro's pricing or Figma's, I think that's how they split it up too, like 4 individuals, 4 teams. That was always the plan. But one of our investors, Thomas from Kotu, made the point that, do we want to be positioning ourselves that way? Or do we want everyone who comes to loom.com to know that we're a team product and not a tool for individuals, not just a tool for individuals? There's nuance to that. But what we ended up doing was we got rid of the plan for individuals. Every single plan that you can buy for Loom allows you to use Loom as a team, even the free plan. You can have as many viewers on a workspace as you like. There's a limit on creators. I think it's up to 25 was the limit we had at time. So we kind of scrapped this whole concept of having a plan that was specifically designed for individuals, and instead it was all about teams. And so gone was the typical thing you see on a lot of SaaS product sites, which I'm not saying is wrong. I actually think it's something you should test, which is it's very common to see 4 teams in the primary navigation of the website, right? And so I'm actually in the camp of, I think that's a good distinction to make on your homepage, especially if you're a product that has been fueled by landing with individuals who then introduce your product to their wider teams. And so my concern with the approach that Loom ended up taking, and I finished up, 4 months after we ended up launching pricing and packaging in market. So I haven't actually caught up with Joe and Vinay and Anik to see how it's performed in market and what we've learned ultimately. I know that the company's doing amazingly well. But I had the concern that if we pivot towards describing ourselves as a teams-based product, do we do that? Do we run the risk of individuals landing on our site and thinking, oh, this is not for me. I don't have a need to use this with my team. I don't want to pay for it as a team. I just want to use it not on my own, but I just want to use it for me. And so that was always a concern that I had. And the only way to validate that is to actually test it in market. And the metrics I would be looking at would have been, visited a sign up conversion. Has there been a material change in the number of individuals that sign up for the product that don't end up using or creating a workspace where they invite people? So I think there are a number of data points that you'd want to look at, but I think the safer approach, again, it's an opinion, Loom's been successful without taking this approach, would be to make a clear distinction of the different paths that you offer to your target customers, whether they're an individual or a team, so that you don't alienate anyone. Does that make sense?
Matt, I have a pretty tactical question on this one, just to follow up. Yep. With companies, Table or Notion, they've been able to explain their product using a lot of very specific templates. For a product like Loom, did you invest in more use case specific landing pages, or how do you go about communicating the various different use cases where Loom can be applicable, but it's quite different depending on your job title?
Totally. Yeah, this was a challenging one for Loom. We actually used Notion and Coda, Airtable as examples when we were thinking about how do we replicate what they do with templates, but with Loom, knowing that you can't necessarily give someone a template for a video message. And so the strategy that we had was, and this was always a belief in something we knew, there's like I called it the education gap, where once people understand what Loom is, people understand what Loom is by seeing examples and by getting a message. They get a message from someone who's sent them a review of a design in Figma. And they're like, oh, I could apply that the next time I need to send out my Figma design. Or I use it frequently to apologize to people when I take, a month and a half to reply to their email. And that's a whole other use case of Loom that I've had people reply to me and go, wow, I never thought about using a video message in that way. It's a much nicer way to apologize to someone than a written response. And so I think people learn about the utility and value of Loom by seeing examples, which is akin to a template, but it's not, you can't just give people a template to create a video message. And so the strategies Loom employed were, before my days, was when you created a workspace, you had a set of example folders or examples in folders to give you kind of a taste of what are all the different ways that you could use Loom. And then in development, while I was wrapping up, was making that more personalized based on our known intent when you signed up for the product. So when you sign up for products, it's pretty common these days to get asked a set of questions, then using that to understand potential, how big might this customer be for us? Should we engage in the sales? But also, the growth or acquisition or onboarding team is trying to get a sense for, well, how are they looking to use the product so I can put them on the right onboarding path and then create the right default experience in the product. So we used a lot of example content, which were actually real Looms that we had created internally because we use the product every single day. Looms that we were comfortable sharing publicly with not a lot of no sensitive information in there. And we just use that really raw, authentic, organic content as examples of how you could use Loom. And then part of our content strategy is we had a series of posts on the blog. I think it was, I'm forgetting the catchy name for it now, but it was like tips from Loommates, where it was like how individual teammates across the departments used Loom. And then George, who's one of the PMMs there, his whole focus for an entire quarter was building out the use case pages that you see on the site today, which was introducing all right, who are our target personas that we feel that Loom is best suited for, where on the homepage, we tell the overarching narrative around why you should care about Loom, touch on how it can be applied, and then based on who you are, you can go deeper and understand about specific applications for your role. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great.
And is it, I'm going to butcher your pronunciation here. Is it Darina?
Darina.
Darina.
Thank you.
Did I answer your question before?
Yeah, the question about pricing and packaging makes sense. I mean, just to kind of say, we are in the camp where you can be a team on any plan. So we thought about splitting it out and saying this is a plan for teams specifically. And it was not an easy path to go down that road. I guess we just never tried it. But the thing is, a lot of our teams are like teams of two. And we have just such a massive customer base of tiny like teams and we're going up market eventually. So we just maybe thought we're not ready for it yet, but I do think it would simplify things.
Yeah, I think, I go back and forth on this because I don't think there's no right answer until you have something in market, and then you have data to inform the decisions, which we didn't have at Loom at the time because we were still on the mode of learning. But one of the potential risks with having your free plan have all of the capabilities for teams and be teams oriented is that you create bloated is the wrong word, but an in-product experience that is not tailored towards an individual, where they have all of these capabilities that they may never not use. And it gets in the way of them actually understanding how to use the product for their specific use case. So for example, I use Loom every single day. Like it's a core part of my stack, especially because I'm in Sydney and my hours don't work. I don't have a lot of overlap hours with a lot of the teams that I work with, specifically on the East Coast of the US and Europe. And so I use Loom a lot for asynchronous communication, but I'm an individual who gets a lot of value out of Loom. I don't work with a specific team. So I have my own workspace, and I never click into 80% of the primary navigation items on the left of the UI because I'm an individual and I just don't have a need for them. So it's like unnecessary noise for me. But does that stop me from using the product? Not really. It's just not a tailored experience for me. But Loom strategy is not building for me, it's building for teams. And so that's a decision that they've made. And so and then I think the thing you want to just make very clear is, like, even if you're an individual or a team, our product can work for you, and then you should tailor the in-product experience based on that. Hide things that don't need to be there, build for progressive disclosure as people need access to features when they have a need for it. So I think there are some things that you can do intelligently with design, but it might not be worth the investment.
Get there. And we don't have a free tier, so everyone pays us. So maybe that's why it's okay. It's less of a problem.
No, it's a good thing. Good problem to have. Everyone pays you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's true.
I just see the chat in here. Oh, wow, I love that Loom use case. I'm assuming you're referring to the apologies that I send. Another great one that I just recommend people start experimenting with is, I get asked to make intros to people all the time. I'm sure we all do. And my standard approach there is I pull up both of the LinkedIn profiles side by side. I have my Loom bubble in the middle, and I do the intro. And people love that. So that's another little hack. And you can do that for free, because if you're taking 5 minutes to introduce someone over Loom, then you have another problem.
That's great. Thanks so much, Matt. Does anyone go ahead and wrap up?
Determine when to grandfather in people when you're testing out new pricing strategies.
Sorry, could you repeat the first part of that?
How do you determine when to grandfather people in? Like whether you should or should not grandfather in previous users that were on a previous plan or a freemium plan or a free plan when you're trying out new pricing strategies? Because we want to try new pricing strategies, but we notice that if we keep grandfathering people in, it creates a lot of tech debt.
Yeah, I'm laughing just because I've experienced that directly. There was a point in time at Intercom, maybe it was around like 2016, where we had 8 variations of our pricing model in market, and it was a mess and led to so much work when you were figuring out, when you were introducing the 9th iteration, how do we explain to these different segments of customers what's changing and making them aware of all the different things that have changed. So I think it's important to grandfather customers, and I'm biased based on my experience at Atlassian. One of their values is don't F the customer. That's one of their 5 values, and I strongly believe in that. I've not been in a position, I was in a position at Intercom where I didn't own the decision on how we grandfathered customers. And there were particular things that were done that I didn't necessarily agree with that I think led to some bad will. And so the lessons learned from that. My general rule of thumb would be reasonable, be respectful of your customers. They are your biggest potential fans and advocates for your product, and keep the long-term view in mind. When you start to think about the short term, or start to optimize for the short term, and I'm talking like 12-month time horizon, that's where you run the risk of having, damaging credibility with your existing customers that have gotten to where you are, that you won't see for maybe 2 years down the track. You won't see the impact of that until later. And so I think be reasonable, be respectful, but there are certain points of time where you might just decide to rip the Band-Aid off. And you feel you have strong conviction that this is the right pricing model for everyone. Maybe this is less about grandfathering, but more about how many pricing models you need to maintain. But you want to rip the Band-Aid off, you migrate everyone to the same pricing model, so you're only maintaining one. But you make use of coupon codes to ensure that people get a fixed discount for 6 months, 12 months, so they don't end up paying more based on new pricing, and you grandfather them that way, if that makes sense. You don't keep them on the old plan, put them on the new one, but make use of discounting to ensure that they don't pay more. And that limits the amount of technical debt that you then carry with you moving forward. Now, there's overhead with doing all that, of course, but my general rule of thumb is treat your customers as best you can. They're the people that got you to where you are today. Another tactic you can employ is, if you want to do a more of a opt-in, but like over time forced in migration to new pricing models, is you only make certain features available if you're on new pricing, which is which I think is fair. I'm maybe overly rational sometimes, but if I buy a car today and then next week a new car comes out, I don't expect to get the features of the new car because I made a purchase decision at this point in time. So I don't think you should ever feel like your customers should get access to all the things you're building for free over time. And at some point they may need to decide to pay more if they want access to new capabilities. And so one way to do that is, you have you can use the product up until this date. If you want to continue using it moving forward, you need to migrate. Or if you want access to these features ahead of time, migrate to our new pricing. And that's a good carrot to put in front of people to get them to selectively opt in. Does that make sense?
I really like the idea of migrating them to the new plan and just coupons or evening out their pricing model for like next few years or whatever time. And that way you're maintaining only one pricing plan instead of multiple, reducing the effect.
We did that in Intercom a couple of times where we, based on a fixed point in time, we migrated you to new pricing, but we made it clear that you'd be paying the same amount for 6 months based on your current usage. But if you were to expand your usage in that time period, then you would pay more. And that seemed to work pretty well because it felt fair. Now the time horizon is the big question. How long do you do that for? A month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? I think at Atlassian, the standard was at the time, this was when we were primarily on-prem, it was 2 years. In SaaS, I've typically seen it range anywhere from a month to 12 months. So
2 years is forever for startups, Matt.
Yeah, exactly. It does not work. So I would say 6 months feels about right to me. Enough time for people to determine, do I want to continue to invest in this product, or do I need to think about switching because I can't afford it anymore, knowing that you'll potentially lose customers when you change pricing. Or you can be super generous and give people 12 months.
Should I sneak a question in here? My co-founder is going to kill me if I don't ask you this question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. So we're Command Bar. The question is about white labeling. So our product is like Intercom in the sense that it lives inside our customers' apps and is user facing. So we have the opportunity to either leave our brand in the product exposed to end users or white label. so far we made the decision to leave our branding in, and it's been a really, really helpful source. It's been our biggest source of inbound so far. But we have seen a range of openness to this. There's some cases where there's just like emotional resistance to having our brand be inside customer's product. Some people don't think it matters at all and are totally okay with it. I know Intercom and I guess Loom to a certain extent also faced like a white labeling decision. So I'd be curious how you'd think about where to fall on the spectrum from, only allow a branded experience, no white labeling possible, to charge for white labeling, to just allow white labeling by default. And I guess even better would be ways to make it more likely that folks will be okay with a branded product.
Yeah. Okay. So
Sorry to drop.
No. It's something that I've got different experiences in based on Loom and Intercom. So I'm just thinking about where to start. So I think the biggest learning, the biggest piece of advice I would have is listen to your customers, understand what is going to be a blocker to them using the product and adopting the product in the first place. So you might find that depending on who you're selling to, and I think this becomes particularly relevant as you move up market, or if you're selling to customers who are very design focused and conscious of design, that not being able to white label is a hard and fast blocker to ever using your product, right? Like I could just imagine like trying to sell into a Figma and saying, no, it's got to be branded command bar. They're going to be like, nope, no, thank you. See you later. Right. And so I think the macro point here would be give your customers the control. Most customers will be willing to pay for that control. And so don't allow white labeling on your freemium offering. Make it a paid feature, but don't make it your feature on your most expensive plan, which Intercom experimented with at a point in time, and it was not met well. Like it just feels at that point, you're like nickel and diming people and not allowing them to control their own product experience. So I think I would sit in the middle, like allow people to white label. They're usually willing to pay for that, but don't make it the most expensive thing they need to pay for. Control is the big theme there. And then Loom is an interesting one. This was a question as we were thinking about the strategy behind the Record SDK, which allows you to embed the Loom experience inside of your own product. And where we landed here was knowing that it would probably be something we learn over time. How much of a blocker is this for certain companies even integrating the SDK? And it likely would be a hard and fast no for quite a few. We started with the approach of we're not going to white label. It's going to be a Loom branded experience because we believe that we have enough credibility in market that people trust the Loom experience. And that will lead to more usage because they trust that if they use Loom to record their screen, it's going to work. It's going to be a fast, simple experience because they've experienced that in the past. So that association with the Loom brand actually added credibility to the feature itself. That was the belief. And they're in private beta right now, so they're probably learning a lot right now about whether that hypothesis is true or not. But I think where I would land is it's something you can't turn off unless you're paying, and make it a paid feature, but don't put it on your enterprise plan.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's pros and cons to the model. I mean, pros, you end up unlocking a lot more data and insights. Like if you want to expand into a new segment of the market, if you want to test a new segment or vertical, sometimes those it's worth kind of removing your own brand awareness if you're trying to expand into like sales as a vertical by partnering with Salesforce. And Salesforce is like notorious for not really using other branded products. They'll want to white label a lot of things. And so it's probably weighing the pros and cons of more adoption, more learning, really impressive logos that you can use to quickly fast follow with others. But on the startup side of things, it's like if there's ways for you to have like, at Zendesk, we saw this, like which is just other people receiving an email from a Stitch Fix or a Latote or any of these e-commerce companies where they just have a high volume of customer service requests that are coming through. Like that's actually a single to almost double-digit percentage of our new leads came from just the powered by Zendesk and the body of an email. And so it was worth fighting for that along the way, especially for consumer companies.
Yeah.
All right, Matt. Well, this was awesome. I know we're a little bit over on time, so thanks for staying a bit longer, and thanks for doing an early morning call with us.
No problem at all. Thanks for those of you who
This
stayed
is
to the bitter
great.
end.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you again, and we'll be turning this into a playbook, so I'm excited to keep learning from you, and thanks again for joining.
No worries. Thanks for all the great questions, everyone.
Talk
Bye
to you
for now.
soon.